My daughter-in-law showed up on a Tuesday morning with a lawyer and a man in a gray suit carrying a briefcase full of numbers. She came to sell the business my family had built on salt water and rope burns for 3 generations. She sat at my kitchen table like she owned it already. I didn't argue. I poured her a glass of sweet tea, set out a second glass, and waited. Because there was a chair at that table she hadn't noticed yet. The lawyer was a thin man with a neat beard and a leather folder he kept touching, like it was going to run away from him. The investor, the one in the gray suit, had the kind of face that doesn't move much. He looked around my kitchen the way people look at houses they're already calculating the value of. Not at the pictures on the wall. Not at the mug rack Ellen had put up 23 years ago with little brass hooks she'd picked out herself. He looked at the square footage. He looked at the windows. He looked at the view of the harbor like it was a number on a spreadsheet. Vanessa sat between them. She was wearing a blazer, the dark navy one she used to save for client meetings back when she was still working in Boston. Her hair was pulled back. She had a folder of her own, thinner than the lawyer's, but held with the same white-knuckle grip. She looked good. She looked prepared. She looked like a woman who had rehearsed what she was about to say in front of a mirror more than once. I set the sweet tea in front of her. She glanced at the glass, then at me. There was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Maybe surprise. Maybe relief. She thought this was going to be easy. She thought I was the old man who brings casseroles and doesn't ask questions. The one who held her while she cried at my son's funeral and never brought up the fact that she stopped returning my calls 3 weeks later. She picked up the glass and took a sip. Then she set it down, opened her folder, and said the words she had probably practiced in her car on the drive over. "Walter, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about Marcus's share of the business. I've spoken with a potential buyer who's prepared to make a very fair offer. I think Marcus would have wanted me to be taken care of." She said it. She said Marcus would have wanted it. She used my son's name like a key she was trying to fit into a lock that didn't belong to her. I kept my face still. I've had a lot of practice at that. 45 years on the Atlantic teaches you how to hold steady when the deck is tilting underneath you. You don't react to the first wave. You wait for the set. The lawyer opened his folder and began laying out papers. He talked about estate rights, about spousal inheritance, about Marcus's 50% ownership stake in Briggs and Son Fishing. He used the phrase equitable resolution 4 times. I counted. The investor sat quietly, briefcase on his lap, waiting for his turn the way a man waits at an auction he's already decided to win. I let them talk. I nodded where nodding seemed appropriate. I kept my hands wrapped around my own glass of sweet tea, the one I'd poured from the same pitcher, the recipe Ellen used to make every summer with Louisiane bags and fresh lemon and just enough sugar to make you forget whatever you were upset about. I'd made it that morning at 5 o'clock, standing in this same kitchen in the dark, squeezing lemons and thinking about my son. When the lawyer finished, the investor leaned forward. He was smooth. I'll give him that. He talked about development potential and coastal enterprise value and transition opportunities. He slid a piece of paper across the table with a number on it. I looked at the number. It was large enough to be insulting, because it assumed that what my family had built for 3 generations could be reduced to a figure on a page. I didn't look at Vanessa. Not yet. I took a slow sip of my tea, set it down, folded my hands on the table. "May I show you something?" I said. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. The lawyer paused. The investor leaned back. I stood up, walked to the living room doorway, and I said, in the same voice I'd used to call someone in for dinner, "Ed, Tommy, Ruth Ann, would you come in, please?" The sound that followed wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when the air gets pulled out of it all at once. Like the moment before a squall hits and the wind just stops and the water goes flat and glassy and you know in your bones that something is about to change. Vanessa turned in her chair. Big Tommy came through the doorway first, filling it the way he fills most doorways, 65 years old, and built like a dock piling. Behind him was Ed Callahan, my attorney, carrying a folder that was considerably thicker than anything on that table. And behind Ed was Ruth Ann, his associate, carrying a second folder and a calm expression that could have frozen salt water. Vanessa's eyes went from Tommy to Ed to Ruth Ann to the folders to me. Her mouth opened slightly. No words came out. The lawyer beside her put his hand flat on the table. The investor's briefcase stayed closed on his lap. I sat back down, picked up my sweet tea. "Now," I said, "let's have that honest conversation, but I'm getting ahead of myself." That's a problem I've always had. Ellen used to say I told stories like, I navigated fog, jumping from one clear patch to another and expecting everyone to keep up. She was right about that. She was right about most things, though I didn't always admit it when she was alive, which is something I think about more often than I'd like to. To understand what happened at that kitchen table on that Tuesday morning, to understand why I had 3 people waiting in my living room and sweet tea already poured, and a chair at the table my daughter-in-law hadn't noticed yet. You need to know about the water, about the rope, about the salt that gets into everything out here, into the wood, into the paint, into your skin, into your family, until you can't tell where the ocean ends and your life begins. You need to know about the boy who grew up on both, and you need to know about the man who never came home from the hospital. My name is Walter Briggs, 71 years old, and I've spent more of my life on the Atlantic than on dry land. Born in Gloucester, Massachusetts, in a house that was 3 blocks from the harbor and smelled like diesel and low tide every time the wind came from the east. My father was a fisherman. His father was a fisherman. His father before him came over from Portugal and fished the Grand Banks in a wooden boat that had no business surviving the crossings it made. But it did, because the men on it were too stubborn to let it sink. I started working the boats when I was 14. Dropped out of school at 16, which my mother never forgave me for, and my father never mentioned, because he understood something she didn't want to accept. The ocean was going to get me one way or another. It was just a question of whether I went prepared or not. By 20, I had my own skiff. By 26, I had a real boat. By 30, I had a business. Briggs Fishing. It was called then, before Marcus came along and I added the "and son" that made it feel complete. I partnered with Tommy Kowalski when we were both 28. 2 young men with salt in their beards, and absolutely no idea what we were doing beyond the fact that we were going to do it together. Tommy was built like a man who had been assembled from spare dock parts. Big hands, big shoulders, a voice that carried across open water without trying. He could fix any engine ever made, and he could read a tide chart the way some people read a novel, with genuine pleasure. We built the business together. 40 years. Cod, haddock, halibut, lobster traps in the season. We weathered regulations, bad years, 2 recessions, and a hurricane in 2012 that put Tommy's truck in a ditch and took the roof off our equipment shed. We replaced the roof. Tommy got a new truck, and we went back out the next morning. Because that's what you do. The ocean doesn't take a day off, and neither do the people who depend on it. I met Ellen Souza at a church picnic in 1979. She was 22. I was 25. She had dark hair and brown eyes and a laugh that made you want to say something funny just to hear it again. She was a school teacher. 2nd grade. She spent her days teaching 7-year-olds how to read. And she spent her evenings waiting for me to come home from the water. And she never once complained about the hours, or the smell, or the worry. Not once. If she did, she kept it from me so well that it amounts to the same thing. Ellen was the kind of woman who made a house into a harbor. That's the only way I know how to describe it. When I came in from the ocean, tired down to the marrow, hands cracked from the salt and the cold, the house was warm. There was food. There was light. There was her, sitting in the kitchen with a book or grading papers or just waiting with a cup of tea, and a look on her face that said, "You're home, and that's enough." She kept the books for the business in the early years. She organized the church rummage sale every September. She remembered the birthday of every person we knew. And I mean every person. Cousins I'd forgotten I had. Neighbors who'd moved away years ago. She sent cards. She made calls. She held the whole web of our life together, with a kind of quiet attention that I didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. Ellen had a stroke 5 years ago. A Tuesday afternoon in October. She was at the kitchen table paying bills. I was at the harbor. Tommy called me on the radio because the hospital had called him when they couldn't reach me. I drove to the hospital doing things with my truck that a man my age should not be doing on public roads. She was alive when I got there. She looked at me. I am certain she knew I was there. But she couldn't speak. The doctors said the damage was extensive. She held on for 3 days. I sat beside her for every hour of those 3 days, and I talked to her about things I should have said years earlier. Things you always think you have time for until you don't. I told her I was sorry for every late night and every missed dinner, and every time she sat in that kitchen waiting for a boat that was taking too long to come home. I told her the house had always been more her than me. I told her she was the best thing that ever happened to a man who spent his whole life looking at the ocean when the most beautiful thing in the world was standing on shore. She passed on a Friday morning. Quietly. The way she did everything. The funeral was big. Ellen knew everyone in Gloucester, and everyone in Gloucester knew her. Father Michael, who had baptized Marcus and married us and buried both of Ellen's parents, did the service. Tommy stood next to me and didn't say a word the entire time, which was exactly what I needed. Some people try to fill the silence when someone dies. Tommy understood that the silence was the point. It was the space where the person used to be. After the funeral, after the casseroles and the cards, and the slow retreat of people back into their own lives, the house went quiet in a way I hadn't known a house could be quiet. Not empty. That would have been easier. It was full. Full of her. Full of the curtains she'd picked out. Full of the recipe cards in her handwriting in the kitchen drawer. Full of the mug rack with the little brass hooks. Full of the smell of the hand lotion she used every night before bed, which I could swear lingered in the bedroom for months after she was gone. I named the boat after her. Not right away. About 6 months after she passed. On a morning when the harbor was still, and the sky was that particular shade of gray that Gloucester gets in March. The kind that isn't sad exactly. Just honest. I painted the name on the stern myself. Ellen. White letters on a dark blue hull. Tommy watched me do it from the dock and nodded once when I finished. And that nod meant more to me than any eulogy. Every morning after that, I went down to the harbor. I stood in front of that boat. Some mornings I talked to her. Some mornings, I just stood there. I didn't know where to go anymore. For 45 years, the pattern had been the same. Ocean, then home. Ocean, then Ellen. Without her, the second half of the pattern was gone, and the first half didn't make as much sense as it used to. I kept going out, though. Because that's what you do. And because the business needed running, and because Tommy was still there, and he needed me the same way I needed him. Even though neither of us would have said it out loud because we're from Gloucester and that's not how we talk. Then Marcus got sick. And the water got darker. Marcus was born in a nor'easter. November of 1983, 2 weeks early. In the middle of the worst storm to hit the Cape Ann coast in a decade. Ellen's water broke at 11 at night while the power was out and the wind was tearing shingles off the roof like it had a personal grudge against our house. I drove her to Addison Gilbert Hospital doing 40 on roads that should have been closed, with both hands on the wheel and Ellen in the passenger seat breathing through her contractions with more calm than I had any right to expect from a woman in labor during a hurricane. He came out screaming. That's what the nurse said. Not crying. Screaming. Like he was angry at the world for pulling him out of somewhere warm and putting him in the middle of all this noise. Ellen always said that explained everything about him. Stubborn enough to arrive in a storm and calm enough to sleep through it 20 minutes later. She wasn't wrong. Marcus grew up on the water the way most kids in Gloucester grew up on the water. Which is to say, it wasn't a choice. It was the weather. It was the view from every window. It was the sound you fell asleep to and the smell you woke up to and the thing your father did for a living that you didn't fully understand until you were old enough to be afraid of it. I took him out on the boat for the first time when he was 8. Ellen didn't want me to. She stood on the dock with her arms crossed, and that look on her face that meant she had already lost the argument, but wanted me to know she hadn't agreed. Marcus was wearing a life jacket that was too big for him, and rubber boots that were too big for him, and a grin that fit him perfectly. He sat on the bow and held the rail with both hands and didn't say a word for the first 30 minutes. Just watched. The water moving. The gulls working. The way the horizon sat flat and endless in every direction. When we got back to the dock, Ellen asked him if he'd been scared. He thought about it for a second. The way he always thought about things. Like the question deserved more than a quick answer. Then he said, "A little. But the good kind." That was Marcus. Everything had a kind. There was the good kind of tired and the bad kind. The good kind of quiet and the empty kind. The good kind of scared and the kind that meant you should turn around. He sorted the world into categories that made more sense than most adults managed, and he did it before he was 10 years old. Tommy taught Marcus how to tie his first knot. A bowline. Marcus was 9, sitting on the dock with his legs dangling over the edge, and Tommy sat down next to him with a piece of line and those enormous hands and showed him the loop, the rabbit hole, around the tree, back through the hole. Marcus got it on the 3rd try. Tommy looked at me and said, "This one's going to be better than both of us." I didn't argue with that then, and I never found a reason to argue with it after. Marcus was never a loud kid. That's important to understand, because it explains a lot about how he lived, and maybe something about how he died. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He didn't slam doors or throw things or make a scene when he was angry. He got quiet. He went inside himself the way the tide goes out, slowly and completely. And when he came back, he had usually figured out whatever he needed to figure out. Ellen used to say he had an old soul, which is one of those things people say about children who make them a little uncomfortable with how much they seem to understand. He worked on the boats every summer from the time he was 14. By 18, he could handle a trawl net as well as any of the men on our crew. By 22, he was running his own trips. He had a feel for it, not just the mechanics, not just the navigation, but the rhythm. He understood the water the way a musician understands a song, not because someone taught him the notes, but because he could hear the music underneath. I gave a benbend? Benbenmitterdend? Plantrigan. Bendia. And he was sitting in the office at the harbor, which is really just a room with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window that looks out at the boats. Tommy was there. Ellen was there. I had the papers drawn up by Ed Callahan, who had handled every piece of legal work I'd ever needed since I was 30 years old. I signed the partnership agreement. Marcus signed it. Tommy signed as witness. And just like that, Briggs Fishing became Briggs & Son. I want to tell you what that felt like, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it. I handed my son half of everything I'd ever built, and it felt like I was giving him nothing at all, because he'd already earned all of it. Every summer on those boats. Every early morning. Every storm he worked through without complaint. The paper was just the paper. The thing itself had been true for years. Marcus had a way of saying things that stayed with you. Not because they were fancy or poetic, because they were right. One evening, we were coming in from a bad day. The catch was poor. The weather had been ugly, and I was in a foul mood, snapping at the crew and complaining about the new regulations that were going to put us all out of business. Marcus was coiling line on the stern, not looking at me, and without raising his voice he said, "Dad, the sea doesn't care who's right. It only cares who's ready." I stopped talking. Not because he'd shut me down, because he was right, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it. That sentence stayed in my head for years. It's still there. It might be the truest thing anyone has ever said to me, and my son said it while coiling rope on the back of a fishing boat on a gray Tuesday evening in Gloucester, Massachusetts like it was nothing. Then he met Vanessa. And for the first time in his life, Marcus started spending his weekends on land. Vanessa Clark came from Boston. Beacon Hill family, accounting degree from Suffolk University. The kind of woman who ironed her jeans and could calculate a tip to the penny before the check hit the table. She came to Gloucester on a long weekend in August with two girlfriends who wanted to eat lobster and take pictures of the harbor. She met Marcus at Praddy's, the bar on Rogers Street where the fishermen go after a good haul and sometimes after a bad one. Marcus was sitting at the end of the bar with a beer he'd been nursing for an hour, still smelling like the ocean because he'd come straight from the boat without changing. Vanessa sat down 2 stools away and asked the bartender what was local. Marcus told me later that he heard her order and thought she was either a tourist or lost. Turns out she was both. In a way. She didn't know anything about Gloucester. She didn't know anything about fishing. She didn't know that the man sitting 2 stools down from her had salt in his bloodline, going back 100 years, and calluses on his hands that told the story of every net he'd ever hauled. But she knew. She told me once at a Christmas dinner years later that when Marcus looked at her and smiled, something in her chest shifted like a compass finding north. They talked for 3 hours that night. She missed her dinner reservation with her friends. Marcus walked her back to her hotel along the waterfront, and the next morning, he took her out on the boat. She was terrified, and she didn't hide it, which Marcus said he respected more than someone pretending to be brave. She held the rail the entire time and asked questions that nobody who grew up around the water would think to ask, like why the waves had different colors and whether the fish knew when the boat was coming. Marcus said he fell in love with the questions. Not the answers. The questions. They dated for a year. Long distance at first. Boston to Gloucester, which is only an hour, but felt like 2 different countries. Vanessa would drive up on Friday evenings and leave Sunday afternoons. She'd sit on the dock and watch Marcus work and read her book and look up every few minutes like she was checking to make sure the ocean was still there. Marcus drove to Boston once a month and came back each time looking like a man who'd been held indoors against his will. Ellen noticed. She said, "That boy is going to marry her, and she's going to try to put him in an office, and he's going to let her think she can." Ellen saw things clearly. It was her gift, and sometimes her curse. They got married in June of 2016. Small ceremony at Our Lady of Good Voyage, the church on Prospect Street, with the blue and white towers that you can see from the harbor. Father Michael officiated. Tommy was Marcus's best man. Vanessa's mother came up from Boston and wore a hat that cost more than my first boat and spent the reception looking at the harbor like she was concerned about property values. I want to be fair about Vanessa. That's important to me, even now, even after everything. For the first 3 years of that marriage, I genuinely liked her. She brought order to Marcus's life in ways that he needed. She organized the business accounts, which had been a mess since Ellen got sick and stopped keeping the books. She reminded Marcus to go to the doctor, to get his teeth cleaned, to renew his fishing license before it expired instead of after. She planned a birthday dinner for Ellen's memory the first year. Called me to ask about Ellen's favorite flowers. Bought white hydrangeas and set them on the table without being asked. That meant something to me. I told her so. She was sharp. She was efficient. She had a way of walking into a room and making it feel like things were about to get organized, whether they wanted to be or not. Marcus seemed happy. He smiled more. He laughed easier. He started coming to Sunday dinners at my house again after a stretch where he'd gotten too busy, and he'd sit at the table and look at Vanessa across from him, and look at me at the head, and something in his face would settle, like a boat finding its mooring. But there were things. Small things. The kind you notice and then unnotice because you want to believe your son chose well and you want to trust the woman he chose. The kind you file away in a drawer in the back of your mind and tell yourself you'll deal with later, except later never comes until it comes all at once. The first Christmas after they married, Vanessa suggested they skip dinner at my house and do a phone call instead. She told Marcus, not me. And I overheard it because I was in the kitchen and they were on the porch, and sound carries in an old house. She said visiting me was a lot, and that she didn't understand why we couldn't just modernize the tradition. Marcus said something I couldn't hear, and they came to dinner. But I heard what she said, and I noticed that she chose the word modernize, which is a word people use when they mean eliminate but want it to sound like progress. There was the time I came over to help Marcus replace a section of gutter on their house. I brought my tools, my ladder, spent 3 hours up there in the cold. Vanessa stood in the doorway the entire time, not helping, not offering coffee or water, just standing there with her arms crossed, watching. When I came down, she said, "You really didn't have to do that, Walter. We could have hired someone." Marcus said she'd had a headache. I let it go. She answered questions I asked Marcus. That happened more than once. I'd say something to him, and she'd respond before he could open his mouth, stepping in with the answer like a secretary intercepting a phone call. Marcus would look at her and then at me and give a small shrug that was supposed to be apologetic but mostly just looked tired. And there was the money thing. It was subtle. Vanessa always paid with credit cards. Always. Even at the diner. Even for a cup of coffee. She'd pull out a card the way some people pull out a wallet, automatically, without thinking. She made comments sometimes about investments, about portfolios, about how Gloucester real estate was undervalued relative to the coastal market. I didn't know what that meant exactly, and I didn't ask, because it felt like a language I wasn't supposed to speak. One evening, maybe 4 years into the marriage, I was at their house for dinner. Marcus was in the kitchen cleaning up. Vanessa was in the living room on the phone with a friend. She didn't know I was in the hallway. I heard her say, clearly and without any particular emotion, "I didn't sign up for this life. I signed up for him. There's a difference." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. I understood what she meant. I understood the distinction she was making. And I understood that it was a distinction that doesn't hold up when the weather turns. Because you can't love a man and reject the sea he came from. Not forever. Not without something breaking. I didn't say anything to Marcus. I told myself it was just a city girl learning to love a fishing town. I told myself she'd come around. I told myself a lot of things that made the silence easier to carry. But some people don't learn to love a place. They learn to endure it. And when the reason they're enduring it disappears, so does everything else. Lily was born on a Sunday morning in March, and she came out screaming like she had somewhere to be. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. A full head of dark hair that stuck up in every direction like she'd already been through a storm. Ellen would have said she got that from Marcus. She would have been right. I wasn't at the hospital when Lily arrived. Vanessa's mother had flown up from Boston, and the delivery room had a limit. And I understood where I fell in the priority list. Marcus called me from the hallway at 6:42 in the morning. His voice cracked on the word girl. He said, "Dad, she's here. She's perfect. You need to come see her." I was in my truck before he finished the sentence. When I held her for the first time, she was asleep. A nurse had wrapped her in one of those hospital blankets with the blue and pink stripes, and she was tucked into it like a letter in an envelope. I sat in the chair by the window and held her against my chest and looked at her face, which was red and scrunched and the most important thing I had ever seen. Marcus stood beside me. Neither of us spoke. Some things don't need language. They just need presence. I thought about Ellen. I thought about her so hard it felt like pushing against a door that wouldn't open. She should have been there. She should have been the one holding this baby, making plans, buying tiny clothes, doing all the things grandmothers do that grandfathers don't know how to do but pretend they'll figure out. Ellen would have been extraordinary at this. She would have had a nickname for this baby by the end of the first hour. She would have had a plan for every holiday, every birthday, every milestone from first tooth to first day of school. Instead, there was just me, a 71-year-old fisherman sitting in a hospital chair with hands too rough for something this small, trying not to cry and failing at it completely. Marcus put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say it's okay, which I appreciated, because it wasn't okay. It was just what it was. A joy with a hole in it. A celebration with an empty chair. Lily grew fast. Babies do. One day she was a bundle you could hold in one arm, and the next she was crawling across my kitchen floor, pulling open the cabinet where Ellen used to keep the pots. By 2, she was running. Not walking. Running. Straight across the yard, straight toward the water, every single time. Like the harbor had a magnet, and she was made of iron. Vanessa would chase after her yelling, "Lily, stop," and Lily would not stop, because she was Marcus's daughter, and stopping was not in the bloodline. By 3, she knew the names of the boats in the harbor. Not because anyone taught her, because she pointed at them and demanded to know, and when you told her, she remembered. The Angela Marie, the Rosalinda, the Captain Jack, and Grandpa's boat, which she called the Ellen boat, and every time she said it, something in my chest would tighten and release at the same time, like a knot being tied and untied in the same motion. By 4, she wanted to go on the water. Vanessa said no. Absolutely not. She said it the way she said most things she felt strongly about, with her jaw set and her arms crossed and a finality that was supposed to end the conversation. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Marcus. And the following Saturday, while Vanessa was at a conference in Providence, Marcus put a life jacket on Lily that was too big for her, and rubber boots that were too big for her, and I swear to you, I swear on everything I have left, she made the same face Marcus had made at 8 years old. The same grin, the same grip on the rail, the same silence for the first 30 minutes, just watching the water move like it was telling her something only she could hear. When we got back, Marcus said, "Don't tell your mother." Lily said, "Tell her what?" And Marcus and I looked at each other and burst out laughing, and it was the best sound in the world. By 5, Lily was coming to the workshop every Saturday. The workshop was a shed at the end of the dock where we stored gear, mended nets, fixed traps. It smelled like rope and salt and diesel and old wood. Marcus had a bench in there where he'd sit and work on the finer repairs, the things that needed patience instead of strength. Lily would sit on an overturned bucket next to him and hand him tools and ask questions that had no reasonable answers, like why fish don't have arms and whether the ocean was lonely at night. After Marcus got too sick to come to the workshop, Lily kept coming. Every Saturday morning, Vanessa would drop her off or Marcus would bring her when he had a good day. And she'd sit on that same bucket next to my bench and hand me tools the way she used to hand them to her father. She never said she missed him being there. She didn't have to. She just filled the space he'd left, the way water fills a hole in the sand. Naturally. Completely. Without being asked. I taught her to tie a bowline knot when she was 5.5. Sat her down on the dock, same spot where Tommy had taught Marcus, with a piece of line and slow hands, and the same words Tommy had used. The loop, the rabbit hole, around the tree, back through the hole. She didn't get it the first time, or the second, or the 5th, but she didn't quit. She sat there with her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth and her small fingers working the rope. And on the 9th try, she pulled it tight and held it up and looked at me with those brown eyes that were so much like Marcus's that I had to look away for a second before I could speak. "You tie this right," I told her. "It holds everything together. You tie it wrong. Everything comes apart when the weight pulls." She thought about that the way her father used to think about things. Carefully, giving the words, the room they needed. Then she said, "Grandpa, is the ocean yours?" I looked at her. I looked at the harbor, at the boats, at the horizon line where the gray water met the gray sky, at the name painted on the stern of the boat closest to us. Ellen, in white letters, on a dark blue hull. "No, sweetheart," I said. "But we belong to it. That's different." She nodded like that made perfect sense. Which it did. Because she was 6 years old, and she already understood something that took me 60 years to figure out. Some things you don't own. You just take care of them until it's someone else's turn. I didn't know that in 6 months, Marcus would be gone. and that little girl would become the only reason I had left to fight for anything at all. Marcus called me on a Thursday evening in April. I was in the kitchen washing dishes by hand, which is something I do even though the house has a perfectly good dishwasher, because Ellen always did them that way, and the habit stuck. The phone rang and I saw his name on the screen, and something shifted in my chest before I even answered. Not a feeling exactly. More like the way water moves before a swell comes through. You can't see it yet, but you can feel it. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you. Can you meet me at the boat tomorrow morning?" In 40 years of being his father, he had never once used those words in that order. Marcus didn't schedule conversations. He just talked to you when he had something to say. Standing on the dock, or leaning against a truck, or passing a wrench in the workshop. The fact that he wanted to meet on the boat told me this wasn't going to be a conversation I'd want to have. Friday morning. 6 o'clock. The harbor was still. Not peaceful still. The kind where the water looks like glass, and the air doesn't move, and everything feels like it's holding itself in place. Marcus was already on the Ellen. He had 2 coffees from the gas station. He handed me one without a word. We motored out past the breakwater. Neither of us spoke. Past 10-Pound Island. Marcus cut the engine. The boat settled. The water lapped against the hull, and my son told me he was dying. Lung cancer. Stage 3. The doctor had found it 2 weeks earlier, after Marcus went in for a cough that wouldn't quit. 2 weeks he'd known, and hadn't told me. He said he needed time to understand it himself before he said it out loud. I understood that. Marcus always needed to sort things into their kinds before he could talk about them. I sat on that boat with coffee going cold in my hand and the ocean flat in every direction, and I listened to my son explain how his body was killing him. He was calm. That's the part that broke me. Calm the way he was always calm. The way he'd been calm coming into the world in a nor'easter and calm coiling rope on the stern. He told me the stage. He told me the treatment plan. He told me the odds, which were not good. And he told me them straight, because he respected me too much to soften it. I didn't speak for a long time. I thought about Ellen. I knew how she would have handled this. She would have cried first, then made a plan, then held Marcus's face in her hands and told him they were going to fight this together. She would have been magnificent. I was not magnificent. I was a 70-year-old man on a boat, named after his dead wife, being told his only son had a timeline. I said, "What do you need from me?" Marcus looked at me with Ellen's eyes in his face and said, "Just keep showing up, Dad. That's all I've ever needed." So I showed up. Every day for 6 months. Chemotherapy started in May, at Beverly Hospital, 40 minutes up the coast. Marcus went in every 2 weeks and came out looking like someone had taken a little more of him each time. The color left first, then the weight, then the steadiness in his hands, those hands that could tie a bowline in the dark. By August, he couldn't grip a coffee mug without concentrating. I drove him to every appointment. We'd take the coast road because Marcus liked looking at the water. Sometimes Lily rode in the back seat. She'd been told Daddy was sick and needed special medicine. She accepted this with a gravity too big for her body. She'd hold Marcus's hand from behind, her small fingers around his thin ones, and sometimes she'd sing little songs from school, off-key and beautiful in the way only a child singing for someone she loves can be. Vanessa handled the paperwork. Insurance claims, hospital bills, pharmacy receipts. I want to be fair about this because it matters later. She did the work. She sat on the phone with insurance companies for hours. She fought for coverage when claims were denied. Marcus had decent insurance through the business, but decent doesn't mean enough when cancer settles in. The insurance covered about 60%. The rest came from somewhere, and that somewhere was Vanessa, pulling from savings, then credit, then places she didn't tell anyone about. I didn't see it then. I was too focused on watching my son disappear in slow motion to notice his wife was drowning in a different kind of water. Tommy kept the business running. Out every morning at 4. managing the crew, handling accounts as best he could. He kept the boats in the water and the paychecks going out without complaint. Because that's who Tommy is, and that's what 40 years of partnership means. The last good day was in September, a Saturday. Marcus felt strong enough to go to the harbor. Not to work, just to sit. I drove him down and we walked to the dock slowly, his hand on my arm, and sat on the bench by the fuel pump where he and Tommy and I had sat 1,000 times before. The sun was out, lobster boats going and coming, the sound of engines and gulls and men shouting across the water in that particular Gloucester way that sounds angry but isn't. Marcus watched it all the way you watch something you're saying goodbye to. Not with sadness exactly, with attention, like he was memorizing every sound and color. He turned to me after a while and said, quiet enough that I had to lean in, "Take care of Lily, Dad. She's the best thing I ever did right." I couldn't speak. I nodded. He nodded back. We sat there, watching the harbor, until the sun went down, and the cold sent us home. He died on a Monday. 6 days later, the hospital called at 5:15. I was already awake. I'd been sitting in the kitchen most of the night, staring out the window at the dark where the harbor should have been. The old fishermen in Gloucester have a saying: when the water is perfectly still, no wind, no chop, nothing moving at all, they say the ocean is holding its breath. That Monday morning, driving to the hospital through the fog, I passed the harbor. The water was glass. Perfectly, completely still. The ocean was holding its breath. And I knew before I got there that it had already let go. The funeral was on a Wednesday. Half of Gloucester showed up, which tells you everything about the kind of man Marcus was, and nothing about how it felt to stand there and receive their kindness. Our Lady of Good Voyage was full. Standing room in the back. Fishermen in clothes they only wore for weddings and funerals, uncomfortable in collars, smelling like soap instead of salt for the first time in weeks. Their wives beside them, holding their arms, holding tissues, holding themselves together in that particular way women do when they know their job is to keep the room from falling apart. Father Michael stood at the altar and said words about Marcus that were true but too small for what had been lost. Every eulogy is too small. That's not the priest's fault. It's just the nature of trying to fit a life into language. Tommy gave the reading. He stood at the lectern with a piece of paper that shook in his hands, and his voice, that voice that could carry across open water, cracked on the second sentence and never fully recovered. He talked about the first time Marcus came out on the boat at 8 years old. About the grin. About how Marcus used to count the seagulls on the way back to harbor because he said it was bad luck to come home without counting something. Tommy said, "I've been fishing 40 years, and I never counted a damn thing until that boy told me to." People laughed. Then they cried. Then they laughed again, which is what happens at funerals when the person who died was someone worth knowing. Lily sat next to me in the front pew. She wore a navy blue dress that Vanessa had bought for the occasion, and black shoes that were a half size too big. She held my hand the entire service, not because she was scared, because she understood, in whatever way a 6-year-old can understand, that holding on was the assignment. Her hand was small and warm, and it didn't let go. Not during the readings, not during the hymns, not during the part where they carried her father's casket down the aisle, and the fishermen standing in the back bowed their heads one by one like a wave moving through the room. At the cemetery, overlooking the harbor, they lowered Marcus into the ground, while the boats below flew their flags at half-staff. I counted 7 boats. Lily would have counted them too, I think, if she'd been looking. But she was looking at me, watching my face the way Marcus used to watch the water, reading what was underneath. After the funeral, the house filled with people and food, and the low murmur of conversations that all say the same thing in different ways. Casseroles appeared on the counter. Someone brought chowder. Someone brought a pie. Vanessa moved through it all with a composure that I admired at the time, thanking people, accepting condolences, keeping Lily fed and presentable. She cried once, briefly, In the kitchen, when she thought no one was looking. I saw it through the doorway and I turned away, because some grief needs privacy. The weeks after settled into a routine that wasn't a routine. Just the absence of the old one. I brought food to Vanessa's house every Sunday. Pot roast, chicken soup, the kind of meals that don't require much from the person eating them, except the willingness to sit down. I offered to help with paperwork, with bills, with anything that needed a second pair of hands or a functioning brain, because I wasn't sure she had either at that point, and I wouldn't have blamed her. I told Vanessa she could stay in the house as long as she needed. Marcus's house. The one they'd bought together 4 years ago. The Cape Cod on Langsford Street with the blue shutters and the view of the harbor from the upstairs bedroom. I meant it. I had no timeline and no expectations. She was my son's wife, and she was Lily's mother. And that was enough. I picked Lily up every Saturday morning for our workshop day. That was my anchor. Whatever else was falling apart, Saturday mornings were solid. I'd pull into the driveway at 8. Lily would come running out the front door with her jacket half on and her boots untied, and we'd drive to the harbor and spend the morning in the workshop, tying knots and telling stories about Marcus and eating the donut I always brought her from Virgilio's on Main Street. For the first month, maybe 6 weeks, things held. Vanessa answered my calls. She accepted the Sunday meals. She had Lily ready on Saturday mornings. She was grieving. I could see that. But she was moving through it, the way you move through fog. Slowly, carefully, trusting that the solid ground was still somewhere underneath. Then things started to shift. Small things at first. The kind you notice the way you notice the barometer dropping. Not alarming yet. Just different. Vanessa stopped returning my calls the same day. Then it became 2 days. Then she'd text instead of calling back. Short messages, 1 or 2 words. Fine. Busy. Thanks. She canceled a Sunday dinner. Then another. She said she wasn't feeling well. She said Lily had a cold. She said she had work to catch up on. I heard her on the phone once when I came to pick up Lily. She was in the kitchen, and she didn't hear me knock. So I waited on the porch. Her voice came through the screen door. She was talking to someone I didn't recognize. And the conversation had a quality to it that didn't sound like grief. It sounded like planning. She used words like timeline and assessment and market position. I told myself it was work. She was a trained accountant. Those were accounting words. I told myself a lot of things. Then came the Saturday that changed the temperature. I pulled into the driveway at 8. Knocked on the door. Vanessa opened it halfway, still in her bathrobe, and said Lily was sick and couldn't come out today. A stomach bug, she said. Nothing serious. I said I hoped she'd feel better. I turned to leave. And as I walked back to my truck, I glanced up at the second-floor window. Lily was standing there. She was fully dressed. She was pressing her hand against the glass. She wasn't sick. She was waving at me. I drove home that Saturday with an empty passenger seat and a feeling I couldn't name. Not yet. But it sat in my chest, the way weather sits on the horizon before it turns. Big Tommy doesn't call after 9 at night. In 40 years, he's called me late exactly 3 times. Once, when the engine room of the Angela Marie caught fire and 2 of our crew were trapped below deck. Once when Hurricane Sandy was bearing down on the harbor and we had to get every boat out of the water in 4 hours. And once when his wife June had a heart attack at the kitchen table and he called me because I was closer than the ambulance. Each time, somebody was in the water. This time, it was me. The phone rang at 9:22 on a Thursday. I was sitting in the living room with the television on, and the volume low, not watching it. Just letting the sound fill the space the way you let a faucet drip when the house gets too quiet. I saw Tommy's name on the screen, and I felt that same shift I'd felt when Marcus called me back in April. That underwater movement before the swell arrives. Walt, he said. He only calls me Walt when something's wrong. The rest of the time, I'm Walter, or Skipper, or Old Man. Walt, I need to tell you something. And I need you to sit down if you're not already. I was already sitting. I told him so. Tommy told me that a man had come to the harbor that afternoon. Gray suit. Leather briefcase. The kind of man who looks at a fishing dock and sees a spreadsheet. He'd asked around about Briggs and Son, asked about the boats, the licenses, the catch volume, the property lease on the dock space. Asked how old the owners were and whether the business was in a transition period. One of our crewmen, Danny Reeves, told Tommy about it because the man had used Vanessa's name. Said she'd sent him. Tommy had done some asking of his own. Careful asking. The kind fishermen are good at. Because information on the docks moves like tide. Sideways and steady. He found out that Vanessa had been talking to a development company out of Boston, a group that bought coastal commercial operations and converted them, which is a polite word for dismantled. She had told people, friends of hers and Marcus's, that Marcus had wanted her to sell. That I was too old to keep running things. That the business was going under anyway and selling now was the smart move. I sat with the phone against my ear, and I listened to Tommy lay this out piece by piece, the way a man lays out evidence he wishes he didn't have. When he finished, neither of us spoke for a while. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the television murmuring behind me. I could hear the old house settling the way it does at night, creaking in the joints the same way I do. How long? I asked. Few weeks at least. Tommy said. Maybe longer. Danny said the suit guy seemed like he'd already been briefed pretty thoroughly. I want to be honest about what I felt. It wasn't anger. Not at first. It was something quieter than that, and much heavier. It was the feeling of finding out that someone you'd fed and comforted and held while they cried at your son's funeral was now, in the quietest way possible, trying to take apart the thing your son had spent his life building. It wasn't betrayal exactly. Betrayal is sharp. This was blunt. Like a rock sitting on your chest. Not cutting you. Just making it hard to breathe. I thanked Tommy. I told him I'd handle it. He said, "You shouldn't have to handle it, Walt. Not after everything." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm here." I said, "I know that too." And we hung up. Because we'd said everything that needed saying. And neither of us was the kind of man who fills silence with words it doesn't need. I sat in that chair for a long time. I thought about Vanessa standing in the doorway while I fixed the gutters. I thought about her saying, she didn't sign up for this life. I thought about the phone call I'd overheard with the words timeline and market position. I thought about Lily pressing her hand against the window, waving at me. Perfectly healthy, perfectly dressed, being kept inside by a lie. And then I thought about Marcus. I thought about him coiling rope on the stern of the boat on a gray Tuesday evening, not looking at me, saying the truest thing anyone had ever said to me. "Dad, the sea doesn't care who's right. It only cares who's ready." I wasn't ready. Not yet. But I was going to be. I turned off the television. Put on my jacket. Walked out the back door into the cold October air and down the hill to the harbor. The dock was empty at that hour. Just the boats rocking in their slips and the water slapping against the pilings and the smell of salt and diesel that has been the smell of my entire life. I went into the workshop, turned on the overhead light, the single bulb that swings when the wind pushes through the gaps in the walls. Marcus's bench was on the left, his tools still hanging on the pegboard, his coffee mug on the shelf, the blue one with the chip on the rim that he'd been using since college and refused to throw away because he said it still held coffee, and that was the only qualification a mug needed. On the shelf above the bench, next to the mug, was the compass box. Mahogany, about the size of a cigar box, with a brass latch that had gone green from the salt air. Marcus had gotten it when he was 12. I'd bought it for him at an antique shop in Rockport, and he'd kept his first compass in it, the one he used to practice navigation before he was old enough to actually go anywhere. Over the years, he'd kept other things in it too. Small things. Important things. The kind of things a man keeps in a box he doesn't show to anyone. I picked it up. It was heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just tired. I held it in my hands, and I felt the weight of it. and I thought about opening it, but something told me not to. Not tonight. I wasn't ready for whatever was in there. Some things you have to be ready for. And I had learned enough in 71 years to know the difference between the moment you want to know and the moment you need to. I set the box back on the shelf. I turned off the light. I walked home in the dark, with the sound of the harbor behind me and the weight of what was coming ahead of me. And somewhere in between, in the space between the water and the road, I started to think about what being ready looked like. 45 years on the ocean teaches you one thing above everything else. You don't wait for the storm to tell you it's coming. You read the water. You watch the color of the sky at the edges. You feel the way the wind shifts a quarter turn before anyone else notices. And you start pulling in your lines and checking your rigging, while everyone else is still looking up and wondering if they need a jacket. I called Ed Callahan the next morning. Ed has been my attorney since I was 30 years old. He handled the business partnership papers. He handled Ellen's will. He handled the property deed on the house. He's 60 years old. Ex-Navy. Built like a man who was meant to stand behind a podium in a courtroom and make people uncomfortable with how right he is. He practices out of a small office on Main Street above the pharmacy, and his window looks out at the harbor, which I've always thought was appropriate for a man whose clients are mostly fishermen and the people who depend on them. I sat in his office that Friday morning and laid it out. All of it. Tommy's phone call. The investor at the dock. What Vanessa had been telling people. The phone call I'd overheard with the words timeline and market position. The Saturday she'd told me Lily was sick when Lily was standing at the window in her clothes, waving at me. Ed listened the way Ed always listens, which is completely. He didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. He just sat there with his hands folded on the desk and his eyes on mine and let me finish. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and said, "All right, Walter. Let's talk about what she can do and what she can't." Here's what Ed told me. Marcus's 50% of the business was part of his estate. Vanessa, as his surviving spouse, had a legitimate claim to inherit that share. That was real. That was the law. Ed didn't sugarcoat it. And I didn't want him to. But here's what else Ed told me. When Marcus and Tommy and I set up the partnership, Ed had drafted the agreement himself. And in that agreement, which I had signed and Marcus had signed and Tommy had witnessed, there were two clauses that Ed said were about to become the most important sentences Vanessa had never read. The first was the right of first refusal. If any partner wanted to sell their share, the remaining partners had the right to match any outside offer and buy it themselves before the share could be sold to a third party. This meant Vanessa could inherit Marcus's 50%, but she couldn't sell it to her Boston developer without first giving Tommy and me the chance to buy it at the same price. The second was the anti-dilution clause. No partner's share could be transferred to an outside party if the remaining partners formally objected, unless a court ordered it. Ed said this clause was strong, not bulletproof, nothing is, but strong enough that any lawyer worth their fee would tell Vanessa that forcing a sale through the courts would take years, cost a fortune, and most likely fail. "Walter," Ed said, "she has a right to the value. That's real. But she does not have the right to destroy the business. To get it. What we need to do is establish a fair market value of Marcus's share through an independent appraiser, and then we offer her a buyout. Clean, legal, fair. And if she says no and tries to go around us, we have the partnership agreement. And it holds." I sat with that for a moment. It was the first time in weeks that the weight on my chest had shifted even slightly. Not lifted. Shifted, like the rock had moved an inch to the left and I could take a slightly deeper breath. "How much?" I asked. Because that was the question underneath the question. How much would it cost to buy out 50% of a fishing business that my family had built over 3 generations? Ed said he'd need the appraisal to give me a number, but based on the boats, the licenses, the dock lease, the equipment, and the annual revenue, He estimated Marcus's share was worth somewhere in the range of $300,000 to $400,000. I didn't have that money. I want to be clear about that because it's important. I had savings. I had the house, which was paid off. I had the business income, which was steady but not extravagant. After Ellen's medical bills and Marcus's funeral expenses, and the general cost of being 71 years old in a country that charges you for every breath you take after 65, my liquid savings were around $80,000. That was a long way from 400. Ed saw my face. He said, "We'll figure it out. There are options. Business loans. Structured buyouts over time. We don't need all of it at once. We just need a plan she can't argue with." I nodded. I thanked him. I stood up to leave, and then I sat back down, because there was something else I needed to say. Ed, if she does this, if she pushes this through and sells to those people, Tommy loses his livelihood. The crew loses their jobs. Every family that depends on those boats loses their income. And I lose the only reason my granddaughter comes to see me every Saturday. Ed looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Then we don't let her do it." I drove to the harbor afterward. Tommy was on the dock, hosing down the deck of the Ellen after the morning run. I told him what Ed had said. I told him about the right of first refusal and the anti-dilution clause. I told him about the buyout, and I told him I didn't have the money. Tommy set down the hose. He wiped his hands on his overalls. He looked at me with those blue eyes that have seen more weather than most people see in 3 lifetimes, and he said, "I'll put up my half. We'll buy it together." I said no. I said, "This is my fight, not yours." Tommy said, "Walter, it stopped being just your fight the day Marcus signed those papers and put his name next to mine. This business is mine too. And that girl is the closest thing I've got to a granddaughter. So with respect, shut up and let me help." I didn't have a response to that. Some arguments you lose because the other person is right, and some arguments you lose because the other person loves you. And Tommy's argument was both. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He looked toward the workshop, toward the door that was closed and the light that was off. And he said, "Walt, there's something you need to see. Something Marcus left in the workshop. He gave it to me the week before he died. Told me to give it to you when the time was right." Tommy paused. "I think this is the time." Tommy drove me to the workshop that evening. Neither of us said much on the way. His truck smelled the way it always smells, like bait and coffee and the pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror that hasn't worked in 3 years, but he keeps because June gave it to him. Some silences are empty. This one was full. He parked at the end of the dock. The harbor was quiet. Just the rigging clinking against masts in the breeze and the low slap of water against pilings. October dark comes early in Gloucester. And by 6, the sky was that deep navy between evening and night that makes the harbor lights look like they're floating on nothing. Tommy unlocked the workshop and turned on the overhead light. The single bulb swung once on its cord, throwing shadows across the walls like slow waves. Everything was the same. The benches, the pegboard, the nets in the corner, Marcus's bench on the left. His tools still hanging. His blue coffee mug with the chip on the rim still on the shelf where he'd left it the last time he was strong enough to come down here. Tommy walked to Marcus's bench. He reached past the mug and brought down the compass box. Mahogany. Brass latch gone green from the salt. The same box I'd held 2 weeks ago in this room and set back down because I wasn't ready. He held it out to me. His hands were steady. His eyes were not. "He gave me this the Thursday before he went into the hospital that last time," Tommy said. "He drove down to the dock by himself. I don't know how he managed it. He could barely walk. He put this box in my hands and said, 'Give this to Dad when the time is right. He'll know what to do with it.'" Tommy's voice caught on the word Dad. He cleared his throat. I asked him when the time would be right. He said I'd know. I took the box and sat down on my bench, across from Marcus's bench, The same spot where we'd sat 1,000 times working on gear and drinking coffee and not talking about things that mattered because the work itself was the conversation. I unlatched the brass clasp. Inside, on a piece of faded blue cloth, was the compass. The first one I'd ever bought him. Brass, about the size of my palm. Glass face cloudy around the edges. He'd been 12. He carried it in his pocket for years, long after GPS made a pocket compass useless. He kept it because it was the first navigation tool he'd ever owned, and Marcus was the kind of man who remembered where things started. Underneath the compass, folded in half, was a piece of lined paper, torn from a spiral notebook. Marcus's handwriting. I recognized it the way you recognize a voice in a crowd. Because some things bypass your eyes and go straight to your chest. The outside said, "For Lily, when she's old enough." From Dad. I looked at Tommy. He was standing by the door with his arms at his sides, and his face was doing something I had never seen in 40 years. Big Tommy Kowalski, the man who hauled 200-pound tuna over gunwales without flinching, who weathered hurricanes and engine fires and the loss of his own brother at sea, was crying. Quietly, without moving, tears running into his beard, and he didn't wipe them away. I unfolded the letter and read my son's last words to his daughter. "Dear Lily, I'm writing this because there are things I want you to know that I might not get the chance to tell you in person. I'm sorry about that. Mostly I'm sorry I won't be there to watch you figure out who you are. I already know you're going to be extraordinary. I knew it the first time you grabbed my finger in the hospital and wouldn't let go. I want to tell you about the ocean. Not the facts. You'll learn those in school. I want to tell you what it means. The ocean doesn't belong to anyone, Lily. Not to me. Not to Grandpa. Not to Uncle Tommy. We belong to it. Grandpa taught me that, and I hope he teaches you. Your grandfather built something that doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to the water, to the town, to every family that eats because our boats go out. It's not a business the way a store is a business. It's a promise. If anyone ever tries to take it apart, show them this letter. And tell them your daddy said the sea doesn't care who's right. It only cares who's ready. Take care of Grandpa for me. He's stronger than the hull of any boat I've ever seen. But even the strongest hull needs a harbor. Be his harbor, Lily. The way Grandma Ellen was. I love you more than the whole Atlantic. And that's a lot of water. Dad." I put the letter down on the bench. I put my hands on my knees. And I cried. Not the quiet kind. Not the dignified kind you do at funerals. When people are watching. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep you didn't know it was there until it breaks the surface. The kind that sounds like something tearing. The kind that a 71-year-old man doesn't do in front of anyone. Unless he can't help it. Tommy walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just stood there and let me break apart in the workshop my son would never walk into again. With the compass on the bench, and the letter beside it, and the overhead bulb swinging slowly and the smell of salt in everything. After a while, the crying stopped the way a squall stops. Not gradually. Just done. I wiped my face. I picked up the letter and read it again. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the box, on top of the compass, and closed the latch. The letter wasn't a legal document. Ed would tell me later. It held no weight in court. No judge would consider it evidence of anything beyond a dying man's wishes for his daughter. But it held the weight of my son's voice. It held everything he believed and everything he wanted Lily to carry forward. And I knew, sitting in that workshop with Tommy's hand on my shoulder and the harbor dark outside, I knew exactly when I was going to use it. Not in a courtroom. At a kitchen table, over a glass of sweet tea that was going to go warm before anyone touched it twice. I spent the next 2 weeks doing what I've always done best. Working with my hands, checking every connection, making sure nothing was loose before the weight came down on it. 45 years of pulling traps and mending nets and reading weather had taught me that preparation isn't something you rush. You do it right, or you do it again. And out on the water, doing it again isn't always an option. Ed moved fast. Within 3 days, he had an independent appraiser lined up, a man named Garrett from Salem, who specialized in commercial maritime operations. Garrett came down, walked the docks, inspected the boats, reviewed the licenses, looked at 5 years of tax returns and revenue statements. He was thorough in the way that people who work with numbers instead of their hands tend to be. Which is to say, he measured everything twice and touched nothing. His report came back 10 days later. Marcus's 50% was valued at $362,000. Ed said the number was fair and defensible, which meant Vanessa's attorney wouldn't be able to argue it up without looking unreasonable. The money problem remained. Tommy and I sat in Ed's office and worked through the options. Ed proposed a structured buyout, 20% up front with the remainder paid over 36 months at a fair interest rate. He said any reasonable person would take that deal because the alternative was a legal fight that would cost Vanessa tens of thousands in attorney fees with no guarantee of a better outcome. Tommy put up $60,000 from his savings without blinking. I put up my $80,000. That gave us $140,000 for the upfront payment, which was more than 20%. Ed said it would be enough to demonstrate good faith. I didn't like taking Tommy's money. I told him that. He said, "Walt, I've been eating at your table for 40 years. Consider this, the tip." That was the end of that conversation. While Ed handled the legal architecture, I did my own kind of work. I called people, carefully, not to build a case, but to understand the shape of what Vanessa had been doing. I called Marcus's friend, Pete Oliveira, who ran a charter boat out of the harbor. Pete said Vanessa had called him 3 weeks earlier, asking whether he knew anyone interested in buying into a fishing operation. He'd told her no, and hadn't thought much of it until I brought it up. I called Sandra Melendez, who had been Ellen's closest friend and who still sent me a Christmas card every year. Sandra said Vanessa had mentioned at a gathering that the business was more trouble than it was worth, and that she was exploring options. Sandra had been uncomfortable but hadn't known who to tell. Then I called Rachel. Rachel Trent, Vanessa's friend from Boston. They'd been college roommates at Suffolk. Rachel had come to the wedding, had come to Marcus's funeral, had always been warm to me in that genuine way that some people from Boston manage, despite everything about Boston that makes warmth difficult. I didn't call to interrogate her. I called to ask how Vanessa was doing, the way a concerned father-in-law would. And Rachel, who had a good heart and no talent for deception, told me more than she meant to. "She's been so stressed, Walter," Rachel said. "The medical bills alone are just crushing. And then there's the other stuff." She paused. I could hear her realize she'd walked through a door she hadn't meant to open. "I just mean, you know, everything piling up. It's a lot for one person." I didn't push. I said I understood. I said I hoped Vanessa was taking care of herself. Rachel said she was trying. We hung up, and I sat with what she'd said. The way you sit with a knot you can't untie right away. You don't yank it. You work it slowly. The medical bills. I knew about those. Marcus's insurance had covered 60% of his treatment. The rest, hundreds of thousands of dollars in chemotherapy, hospital stays, medications, specialist consultations, lab work, imaging, had landed on Vanessa. I'd been too focused on Marcus to pay attention to the paperwork she was handling, and she'd been too proud or too scared or too overwhelmed to ask for help. That debt was real. That debt was Marcus's illness made into numbers on a page, and it sat on Vanessa's shoulders like an anchor she'd been dragging for months. But Rachel had said the other stuff. And over the next few days, through a conversation here and a detail there, the shape of the other stuff became clearer. Vanessa had her own debts. Credit cards. A car payment on a vehicle that cost more than a reasonable person in her situation should have been driving. Spending that had outpaced her income for longer than the marriage had been in trouble. This wasn't Marcus's illness. This was something older, something that had been there before the diagnosis. Something she'd hidden the way people hide the debts that embarrass them, under confidence and good clothes. and the assumption that the next paycheck would fix what the last one didn't. I sat with all of this in my kitchen on a Tuesday night, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. I looked out the window at the harbor lights, and I thought about Vanessa. Not the Vanessa who had lied about Lily being sick, not the Vanessa who had sent a man in a gray suit to my dock. The other one. The one who had sat on the phone with insurance companies for hours fighting for coverage. The one who had organized every receipt and every claim while her husband was dying in a hospital bed. The one who had cried in the kitchen at the funeral when she thought nobody was watching. I thought about grief and fear living in the same body. I thought about how desperation makes people reach for things they know aren't theirs, not because they're bad, but because they're drowning and the thing is floating nearby, and the hand moves before the conscience can catch up. I didn't change my mind. I was still going to protect the business. I was still going to protect Lily's Saturdays. I was still going to sit at my kitchen table and show Vanessa exactly where the law stood and where she didn't. But I changed how I was going to do it. Because understanding someone doesn't mean agreeing with them, it means seeing the whole picture instead of just the part that makes you angry. Then Vanessa called. A Wednesday evening. Her voice was tight and formal. The way it got when she was performing a version of herself she thought the situation required. Walter, I'd like to come see you. I have some things I'd like to discuss about the business. About Marcus's share. I'll be bringing my attorney and a potential buyer, I said. Come Tuesday morning. I'll make sweet tea. She said that would be fine. We hung up, and then I called Ed. I woke at 4:30 that Tuesday. Didn't need the alarm. Some mornings, your body knows what's coming, before your mind agrees to face it. I lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the house. The furnace clicking on, the wind off the harbor pressing against the windows. The particular silence of a home that has held too many people and now holds only one. I got up. Put on coffee for myself first, because whatever the day was about to become, it was going to start the way every day starts. With a cup of coffee in a quiet kitchen while the sky outside goes from black to gray to whatever shade of blue or white Gloucester has decided to wear. Then I made the sweet tea. Ellen's recipe. She never wrote it down, which drove me crazy when she was alive and broke my heart after she was gone, because I had to reconstruct it from memory and taste, and the particular way the kitchen smelled when she was making it on a July afternoon. 4 bags of Louisiane. Steeped in boiling water for exactly 7 minutes. A cup and a quarter of sugar dissolved while the water was still hot. Cold water to fill the pitcher. Fresh lemon, 2 slices floating on top. Ellen always said the lemon wasn't about flavor. It was about making the glass look like someone cared enough to put something beautiful in it. I poured the tea into the good pitcher. The glass one with the etched flowers that Ellen's mother had given us as a wedding present. I set out glasses, 4 of them on the kitchen table, plus 2 more on the counter for Ed and Ruth Ann. I didn't know if anyone would drink any of it. That wasn't the point. The point was that when Vanessa walked into this kitchen, she was going to see a table set by a man who had taken the time to prepare, and she was going to have to decide what that meant. I set out a chair. Not just any chair. Marcus's chair. The oak one with the slightly uneven legs that he'd sat in every Sunday dinner for years. The one that rocked a 1/4 inch to the left if you leaned back. The one I'd told him I'd fix a dozen times and never did. Because fixing it would have meant admitting it was broken. And neither of us wanted to admit that about anything. I pulled it from the corner where it had been since the last Sunday dinner Marcus attended, 2 weeks before he went into the hospital for the last time, and I set it at the table. At the head, where it belonged. Then I got dressed. I put on the navy blue shirt, the one Marcus had given me for Father's Day, the year before he died. He'd bought it at a shop in Rockport, which I knew because he'd left the receipt in the breast pocket, and I'd found it while doing laundry, which is something I never told him, and now wish I had, because the small things you don't say become the biggest things you carry. I buttoned it slowly, looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, an old man with white hair and weathered skin, and hands that had hauled 10,000 pounds of fish, and held 1 wife and 1 son, and one granddaughter, and built something that mattered. I looked tired. I looked ready. I wasn't sure there was a difference. Ed arrived at 7:30. He came through the side door, the way I'd told him to, carrying a leather briefcase that was thicker than the last time I'd seen it. Behind him was Ruth Ann Patterson, his associate, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of calm, precise demeanor that made you feel like every document in the world was exactly where it was supposed to be. Ruth Ann carried a second briefcase and a legal pad and a pen that she clicked once before sitting down in the living room, which I took as a signal that she was now operational. Ed laid out the documents on the coffee table. The partnership agreement, the right of first refusal clause, highlighted. The anti-dilution clause, highlighted. Garrett's independent appraisal, the buyout proposal, printed on Ed's letterhead, clean and professional, and leaving no room for ambiguity. The upfront payment amount, the installment schedule, the terms. Tommy arrived at 8. He came through the same side door, wearing a clean flannel shirt that I hadn't seen before, which meant June had made him buy it for this occasion. He looked uncomfortable in it, the way Tommy looks uncomfortable in anything that isn't stained with engine grease. He sat in the living room next to Ed and Ruth Ann and folded his hands in his lap and didn't say a word. Because Tommy understood that his job today was the same job he'd done at Ellen's funeral. Be there. Be solid. Let the silence do the work. I put the compass box on the kitchen counter. Close enough to reach. Far enough to not be obvious. At 8:50, I stood at the kitchen window. The harbor was busy. Lobster boats heading out. Gulls working the thermals above the breakwater. The sun was up but not warm yet. That October light that makes everything look sharp and clean and slightly too honest, like a photograph with the contrast turned up. At 9:02, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. Behind it, a silver SUV. I watched Vanessa get out of the sedan. Blazer. Dark navy. The same one from client meetings. Hair pulled back. Folder under her arm. She stood by the car for a moment, checking her phone, smoothing the front of her blazer with her free hand. Then the lawyer got out of the passenger side. Thin man, neat beard, leather folder, and from the silver SUV, the investor. Gray suit, briefcase, the face that doesn't move much. I watched them walk up the path to my front door. 3 of them, side by side, like a delegation arriving to negotiate terms. And I noticed something. Vanessa's hand, the one not holding the folder, was trembling. Just slightly, just enough that I could see it from the window. She pressed it flat against her side to stop it, the way you press a hand against a wound to keep it from showing. She was scared. I could see it from 15 feet away through a pane of glass. She was scared the way people are scared when they've committed to something they're no longer sure about but can't find the exit. She knocked. 3 times. Firm. Practiced. I walked to the door. I opened it. She looked at the kitchen behind me. The glasses of sweet tea on the table. The lemon slices floating. The chair at the head. The good pitcher with the etched flowers. Something crossed her face. Relief. Maybe. The way a person looks when they think the hardest part is going to be easier than they feared. I stepped aside. I said, "Come on in. There's plenty to go around." She walked past me and sat down at the table, and the lawyer and the investor followed, and they settled into their chairs with the particular confidence of people who believe they are about to get what they came for. Vanessa reached for the sweet tea. She took a sip. She set it down. And she smiled the smile of a woman who thought she was sitting across from a soft old man who made tea and didn't ask questions. She had no idea who was in the next room. The lawyer spoke first. He introduced himself as David Kern, attorney at law, representing Vanessa Briggs in the matter of estate distribution related to the late Marcus Briggs. He said it like he was reading it off the inside of his eyelids. Rehearsed and flattened into the kind of language that turns people into cases and kitchens into courtrooms. He opened his leather folder and removed a stack of papers held together with a black binder clip and set them on my table between the sweet tea and the shortbread I'd put out and forgotten to mention. Vanessa sat with her hands folded on top of her own folder. She was watching me. Not the lawyer. Me. Looking for something in my face. A crack, maybe. A flinch. Some sign of what I was thinking. I gave her nothing. 45 years of reading weather had made my face as useful as a harbor wall. It showed exactly what I wanted it to show. Which right then was a man drinking sweet tea at his own kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. Patient and unhurried. The lawyer laid out the argument. Marcus Briggs had been a 50% partner in Briggs and Son Fishing. Upon his death, that share became part of his estate. Vanessa, as surviving spouse, was the sole beneficiary. She had the right to liquidate that share at fair market value. He slid a document across the table, an offer letter from the investor, whose name was Gerald Pratt, representing Coastal Meridian Development out of Boston. The offer was $420,000 for Marcus's 50% stake, contingent on full operational transfer within 90 days. $420,000. More than Garrett's independent appraisal by nearly $60,000. That was intentional. It was meant to make my buyout look small. And it was meant to make their number feel generous. It was meant to make me feel like a man standing in the way of a reasonable offer. Pratt spoke next. He was smoother than the lawyer, which is saying something. He talked about transitional development and maritime asset optimization and employment continuity for key personnel, which I understood to mean he would buy the business, change everything about it, and keep a few people around long enough to learn how things worked before replacing them with people from somewhere else. He had charts in his briefcase. He had projections. He had a 5-year plan printed on heavy paper with a logo in the corner that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never been on a boat. I let him finish. I let him lay his charts on my table next to the sweet tea and the shortbread and the lawyer's documents. I let the whole presentation settle into the room like a tide coming in, slow and sure and taking up space. Then Vanessa spoke. She had been waiting for her turn the way a person waits to deliver the line they've been practicing. She leaned forward slightly and looked at me with an expression that was halfway between sympathy and steel. "Walter," she said, "I know this is difficult. I know this business means a lot to you. But Marcus is gone, and I have to think about my future, about Lily's future." She paused. "Let the name hang in the air. This is a fair offer. More than fair. And I believe Marcus would have wanted me to be taken care of." She said it. She used his name, and she used his daughter's name. And she used the phrase, "would have wanted," in the same breath, and she did it across a table where Marcus had sat every Sunday for years in the oak chair that was now at the head of the table with no one in it, and she didn't seem to notice the chair or what it meant or who it was for. I took a sip of my sweet tea. I set it down. I looked at David Kern with his binder clips. I looked at Gerald Pratt with his charts. I looked at Vanessa with her folder and her blazer and her steady voice and her trembling hand pressed against her thigh where she thought I couldn't see it. "May I show you something?" I said. Vanessa tilted her head. The lawyer paused. Pratt leaned back half an inch. I stood up. I didn't rush. I walked to the living room doorway, the one that opens onto the hall, and I said, in the same voice I'd used to invite someone to the table, "Ed, Tommy, Ruth Ann, would you come in, please?" The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of understanding, arriving all at once, the way a wave doesn't build gradually when it hits the rocks. It just arrives. Tommy came through the doorway first. He filled it the way he fills most doorways. He was wearing June's flannel shirt, and his face was set in the expression he wears when a storm is close and the only thing left to do is work through it. He looked at Vanessa. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, but the way a compass needle shifts when the magnetic field changes. She hadn't expected Tommy. Tommy was supposed to be on a boat somewhere, Tommy was supposed to be out of the picture. Behind Tommy came Ed Callahan, briefcase in hand, reading glasses already on. The kind of man who walks into a room and makes the room rearrange itself around him without anyone deciding to do it. He nodded once at Vanessa, once at the lawyer. He did not acknowledge Pratt at all, which I thought was a nice touch. Behind Ed came Ruth Ann. Second briefcase. Legal pad. Pen clicked and ready. She sat down at the table in the seat next to Ed, with the economy of movement that comes from having done this many times before. David Kern, Vanessa's lawyer, put his hand flat on the table. It was a small gesture, but I noticed it. It was the gesture of a man recalculating. Gerald Pratt's briefcase stayed on his lap. His charts stayed on the table. But his posture changed. The lean became a settle. The confidence became something closer to attention. Vanessa looked at Ed's briefcase. She looked at Ruth Ann's legal pad. She looked at Tommy, solid as a dock piling, sitting at her left. She looked at me. I sat back down, picked up my sweet tea. Now, I said. You mentioned an honest conversation. Let's have one. Ed opened his briefcase. He removed the partnership agreement, the original, signed by me, signed by Marcus, witnessed by Tommy, drafted by Ed himself 18 years ago in his office, above the pharmacy on Main Street. He set it on the table. Then, he removed the highlighted copy of the right of first refusal clause. He set that on the table. Then, the anti-dilution clause. Then, Garrett's independent appraisal. Then the buyout proposal, printed on Ed's letterhead. One by one, document by document, he laid them out across my kitchen table, the way you lay out tools before a job, each one in its place, each one ready to do its work. David Kern picked up the partnership agreement and began reading. His face did not change for the first page. On the second page, at the clause Ed had highlighted in yellow, his eyes stopped moving. He read it again. Then he looked at Ed. Then he looked at Vanessa. Ed waited. Ed didn't rush. That was the thing about Ed Callahan that made him devastating in a room where other people had already decided they were going to win. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply laid out the truth, the way you lay out a net on the dock, flat and even and impossible to miss. He started with the partnership agreement. The signatures at the bottom. Mine, Marcus's, Tommy's, as witness. 18 years, in continuous legal effect. Then, the right of first refusal. He read the clause aloud with the authority of a man who had written the words himself. If any partner wished to sell or transfer their share, the remaining partners had the right to match any outside offer before it could be sold to a third party. Irrevocable. Applying to any successor, heir, or assignee. Ed looked at Vanessa when he said heir. He didn't linger. He didn't need to. Then the anti-dilution clause. No share could be transferred to an outside party over the formal objection of the remaining partners, unless ordered by a court. Ed cited 2 Massachusetts cases by name. David Kern's jaw tightened half an inch. Ruth Ann opened the appraisal. She walked through it clearly. Boats, licenses, dock lease, equipment, 5-year revenue. When she finished, she said, "The independent appraised value of Marcus Briggs's 50% share is $362,000, $60,000 less than Gerald Pratt's offer." The difference filled the room like a draft in winter. Ed placed the buyout proposal on the table and slid it to Kern. $140,000 up front. Remainder over 36 months at 3%. Total payout, $376,000, $14,000 above appraisal with interest. "This is a fair offer," Ed said. "It preserves Miss Briggs's right to the full value of her late husband's share without requiring the dissolution of the business." He paused. "Mr. Kern, I'd encourage you to review sections 4, 7, and 12 of the partnership agreement before advising your client. The path she's been pursuing is not only legally untenable, but potentially exposes her to counterclaims related to tortious interference with a business relationship. Kern picked up the agreement. Read section 4, 7, 12. His face went still, very still. He leaned toward Vanessa and whispered something I couldn't hear, but could read the shape of. It was a man telling his client the situation had changed. Gerald Pratt closed his briefcase with a soft click. He didn't look at me, or Tommy. He looked at his charts, still spread on the table, and left them there, which told me everything about what those charts had ever been worth. Vanessa's eyes moved from Kern to Pratt to Ed to the documents. Her folder sat open, the Coastal Meridian offer letter still visible inside. She didn't pick it up. She looked at me. Not angry, not defeated, bewildered. Like someone who had walked into a room believing they understood the layout and discovered every wall was somewhere else. "You planned all of this," she said quietly. I thought about the 2 weeks of calls and documents and appraisals. The coffees in Ed's office while numbers were run and clauses reviewed, and the proposal was drafted until Ed said it was airtight. "I prepared for it," I said. "There's a difference." The room went quiet. Sweet tea warming in the glasses. Shortbread untouched. Marcus's chair empty at the head of the table. For a moment, I thought I could feel him there. Not as a ghost, as a weight in the wood. A patience that had outlasted everything. Then I did what I had been waiting to do since the workshop. I walked to the counter, picked up the compass box, set it on the table in front of Vanessa, next to her untouched tea and her open folder, and the offer letter that no longer mattered. "This isn't for you, Vanessa," I said. "This is for Lily. Marcus wrote it before he died. But I think you should read it first." I opened the box, took out the letter, unfolded it, and placed it in front of her. She looked at the handwriting. I saw recognition hit her, the way a wave hits a hull. All at once. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it on grocery lists, birthday cards, and the note he left on the counter the morning he went to the hospital for the last time. "Back soon. Love you both." She read the letter. The kitchen was silent. Ed was silent. Ruth Ann, Tommy, Kern, all silent. Pratt was already thinking about the drive to Boston, and I sat across from my son's widow and watched her read the last thing he ever wrote. She didn't cry the way I had in the workshop. She cried the way water rises. Slowly, filling from the bottom. Her eyes got wet. Her lips pressed together. Her chin trembled once. Then the tears came without sound, sliding down her face onto the letter, onto Marcus's handwriting, onto the words, "The sea doesn't care who's right. It only cares who's ready." She put the letter down. She looked at me. And for the first time since Marcus died, she looked at me like I was his father. Not like I was an obstacle. Not like I was a resource or a problem to be managed. Like a woman looking at the father of the man she had loved. And whatever else was broken between us, that one thing, in that one moment, was true. After Ed and Ruth Ann left, after David Kern shook my hand without quite looking me in the eye and walked to his car with his leather folder held against his chest like a shield, after Gerald Pratt drove away in his silver SUV without collecting his charts from my kitchen table, after Tommy squeezed my shoulder at the side door and said, "You did good, Walt." And I said, "We did good." And he nodded and walked out into the October morning. It was just the two of us, Vanessa and me, at the kitchen table. The sweet tea had gone warm in the glasses. The shortbread was still untouched on the plate. Marcus's chair sat empty at the head. Pratt's charts were still spread across one end of the table like artifacts from a civilization that had just collapsed. Neither of us moved to clear them. The silence lasted a long time. Not the hostile kind. Not the strategic kind. The kind that comes after something important has happened, and both people in the room need a minute to figure out what they are now that the thing they were before has ended. Vanessa was looking at the letter. It was still on the table in front of her. Marcus's handwriting on lined paper. The words blurred slightly where her tears had landed. She wasn't reading it anymore. She was just looking at it the way you look at a photograph of someone you'll never see again. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The blazer voice was gone. The practiced voice was gone. What was left was smaller and rawer and closer to the woman Marcus had fallen in love with at a bar on Rogers Street 8 years ago. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to just listen." I nodded. She told me about the medical bills. All of them. The numbers she'd been carrying since Marcus's first chemotherapy session. The insurance covered 60%. She said that number the way people say numbers that have haunted them, flat and precise and burned into memory. The other 40% was hers: hospital bills, specialist fees, lab work, imaging, pharmacy costs for medications that cost more per pill than most people spend on groceries in a week. The total, when she added it all up, was $237,000. She had used their savings first, then her own savings, then credit cards, then a personal loan from a bank in Boston that charged interest rates she was ashamed to say out loud. She told me she had been drowning since August, since the bills started outpacing every resource she had, and that she hadn't told anyone because she didn't know how to say the words, "I can't afford to keep my husband alive," without feeling like she was failing him. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I kept my hands around my glass of warm sweet tea, and I let her talk, because I understood that this was the first time she had said any of this to anyone, and the act of saying it was costing her something she needed to spend. Then she told me the rest. The part that was harder. The credit card debt that had nothing to do with Marcus. The car she couldn't afford. The spending that had been there before the diagnosis, before the marriage started straining, before any of this. She said it without excuses. She said it the way you say something you've been avoiding for so long that the avoidance itself has become heavier than the truth. "I know I was wrong," she said. "I know Marcus wouldn't have wanted any of this. But I was scared, Walter. I was scared I was going to lose everything. The house, the car, my credit, my ability to take care of Lily." She paused. Her voice broke on Lily's name the way Tommy's had broken on the word dad in the workshop. "I didn't know what else to do. And I didn't think you'd help me. I thought you'd judge me." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the woman who had organized every insurance claim, who had sat on hold for hours, fighting for coverage, who had cried in the kitchen at the funeral, when she thought no one was looking, who had carried $250,000 in debt on her shoulders, while also carrying the grief of losing her husband, and who had made a terrible decision not because she was terrible, but because she was afraid and alone, and the thing floating nearest to her looked like a way out. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were red. Her mascara had run, and she hadn't wiped it. She didn't look like a woman in a blazer with a strategy anymore. She looked like a 37-year-old widow, sitting in her father-in-law's kitchen with nothing left to perform. "Because I was ashamed," she said. "And because I didn't think you'd understand. I'm sitting here, aren't I?" I said. She didn't respond to that. She just looked at me, and something in her face shifted the way the light shifts on the water when a cloud passes, and suddenly you can see all the way to the bottom. I told her what I was willing to do. I said it plainly, because Marcus would have wanted me to say it plainly, and because I was too tired for anything other than the truth. The medical bills were Marcus's debt. They were the cost of trying to keep my son alive. That made them my debt too, in every way that mattered. I would pay them, not from the buyout, from myself, from my savings and from the business revenue and from whatever I had to rearrange to make the numbers work. Ed would set it up properly. It would take time, but it would get done. But her personal debts, the credit cards, the car, the spending that had been hers before any of this, those were hers. I couldn't carry those, and she shouldn't expect me to. That was the line. And there was one condition. Lily stays connected to Gloucester. Every Saturday morning, the way it's been. Workshop, harbor, the boats, the water, The knots. She belongs to this place the way her father belonged to it, and no amount of distance or difficulty was going to change that. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that I carry with me still. The way I carry Marcus's compass and Ellen's sweet tea recipe, and the sound of Lily's voice asking if the ocean is lonely at night. She said, "He was right about you." I looked at her. I could have asked what Marcus had said. Part of me wanted to, but a bigger part of me understood that some things are better left in the space between people, where they can mean whatever they need to mean without being pinned down by specifics. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. She came back the following Saturday to collect Marcus's things. This time she wore jeans and a sweatshirt, and she looked more like the woman Marcus had brought home 8 years ago than the one who had sat across from me with a lawyer and an investor and a folder full of numbers that didn't add up to anything that mattered. I had the boxes ready. I'd packed them myself the night before, sitting on the floor of the room that had been Marcus's when he was a boy, and was now mostly storage and memory. His photographs. All of them. Because they were hers as much as mine. And I wasn't going to be the kind of man who divides pictures of his own son into yours and mine. His books. The paperbacks he'd kept since college. Dog-eared and salt-stained. The jacket he wore on the boat, the heavy canvas, one with the torn pocket he'd never fixed, because he said the tear gave it character. His college diploma. A few things from his desk at the office that Tommy had brought over in a grocery bag. I did not pack the compass box. I set it on the kitchen counter where Vanessa could see it. She noticed it when she came in. She looked at it and then at me. "That stays here," I said. "For Lily. When she's ready." Vanessa nodded. She didn't argue. I think she understood, after reading that letter, that some things belong to the people they were written for, not the people who happened to be holding them. She packed the boxes into her car quietly. I helped carry the heavier ones. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said at a kitchen table over warm sweet tea and a letter that changed the shape of everything. When the car was loaded, Lily came running out of the house. She'd been inside watching television, or pretending to, the way children pretend to be occupied when they know something important is happening around them. "Mommy, are we going on a trip?" she asked, looking at the boxes in the back seat. Vanessa knelt down. She took Lily's hands. "Mommy's going to stay in Boston for a while, baby. But you're going to spend lots of time with Grandpa. Every Saturday. Just like always." Lily looked at me. Then back at Vanessa. Then back at me. She was processing it the way Marcus used to process things. Carefully. Giving the information room to settle before responding. Then she said, "Okay. Just that. Okay." And she hugged Vanessa. And Vanessa held her for a long time, long enough that I looked away because some things between a mother and daughter need to happen without an audience. At the car, Vanessa stopped. She turned around. The October wind was pulling at her hair, and the leaves on the oak tree in the side yard were coming loose in ones and twos, drifting down like they had all the time in the world. "I did love him, Walter," she said. I looked at her. I thought about the woman who had organized the insurance claims, the woman who had cried in the kitchen, the woman who had carried $250,000 in silence because she was too proud and too scared to ask for help, the woman who had made a terrible mistake and was standing in my driveway with her dead husband's things in the back seat and her daughter holding a stranger's hand, except the stranger was me, and I wasn't a stranger at all. "I know you did," I said. "And he loved you enough to try to fix things you didn't even ask him to fix." She understood what I meant. I could see it land. Marcus had worried about her, had known about the stress, maybe about the debt, maybe about the way the marriage was bending under the weight of a life she hadn't signed up for. He'd carried that quietly, the way he carried everything, and he'd tried to hold it together without telling anyone. It was falling apart. Her eyes got wet. She didn't say anything else. She got in the car. She drove away. Lily stood in the driveway waving until the car turned the corner. Then she reached up and took my hand. Her fingers were small and warm, and they wrapped around mine with the certainty of a bowline knot tied right. "Grandpa, can we go see the boats?" I said. "Yeah, sweetheart. Let's go see the boats." The weeks after were quieter than I expected. Not the heavy quiet. The kind that comes after a storm passes, and you walk outside, and everything is still there. The dock, the boats, the harbor, the morning light doing what it does to the water, turning it from black to silver to blue. Still there. All of it. Ed handled the paperwork. The buyout was signed. The medical debt was being restructured through a plan Ed set up that would take time but would get done, the way everything gets done when you're patient and the connections are solid. Vanessa's lawyer sent a letter accepting the terms. No court, no hearing, no public record. The whole thing folded up quietly, the way most things do when the truth gets laid out in good light. Mrs. Keegan, my neighbor across the street, brought over a pot of clam chowder that Thursday. She'd been living on our street longer than I had. A retired schoolteacher, with white hair and opinions about everything, and a heart that she hid behind both. She left the chowder on the porch with a note that said, "The harbor is better with you in it." I put the note on the refrigerator next to a drawing Lily had made of a boat with too many sails and a sun with a face. I started going to a grief group at the church on Wednesday evenings. Father Michael ran it. Not because anyone pushed me, but because I'd been sitting alone with too much for too long, and I could feel it starting to harden into something that wasn't grief anymore but stubbornness, which is grief's ugly cousin. The group was mostly women. Widows of fishermen who had outlived the sea, or been outlived by it. And one man about my age named Gil, who had lost his daughter in a boating accident off Rockport 3 years earlier. Gil and I started going for breakfast after the Wednesday sessions at a diner on Washington Street. He didn't try to fix anything. Neither did I. We just sat across from each other and ate eggs, and talked about the people we'd lost and the weather and sometimes nothing at all. Lily came every Saturday. 8 o'clock. Boots untied. Jacket half on. Donut from Virgilio's. Workshop. Harbor. Knots. She tied a bowline perfectly for the first time on a Saturday in November. She'd been trying for weeks. I watched her small fingers work the rope, the loop, the rabbit hole. Around the tree. Back through. And when she pulled it tight and held it up, her face did the thing Marcus's face used to do when he got something right. Not pride exactly. Recognition. Like she'd found something that had been waiting for her. "Grandpa, Daddy would be proud of me, right?" I looked at her. 6 years old. Brown eyes. Marcus's eyes. Holding a bowline knot in her hands, like it was the most important thing in the world. And in that moment, it was. "He is, sweetheart," I said. "He is." A month later, Vanessa sent a text. Not a call. A text. 5 words. "Thank you for not giving up on her." I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because I didn't need to. Some things are understood better in the silence between the waves. I repainted the boat in the spring. She needed it. The salt had gotten to her hull over the winter, the way it does to everything out here eventually. Wood, paint, iron, people. The salt gets in, and it works on you, slowly. Not with malice. Just with patience, until the surface you started with isn't the surface you have anymore. You either repaint or you let it go. And I've never been good at letting things go. I sanded her down on a Tuesday morning in April. Tommy helped for the first hour. Then his knees told him to stop, and he went and sat on the dock with a coffee and supervised, which is what he calls sitting in a folding chair and pointing out spots I missed. The hull was dark blue, the same color she'd always been, the color Ellen had chosen when I asked her what a boat named after her should look like. She'd said, "Dark blue. Like the ocean at dusk, when it's serious but still beautiful." That was Ellen. She could describe a paint color and break your heart at the same time. I painted the hull. 2 coats. Let it dry overnight. And the next morning early, before Tommy arrived, before the harbor woke up, I took a small brush and white paint, and I added 2 words to the stern: Ellen and Lily. I stood back and looked at it. The white letters on the dark blue hull, the old name and the new one side by side. It didn't look like a correction. It didn't look like a replacement. It looked like a continuation. Which is what it was. Tommy arrived at 7. He walked down the dock, saw the stern, and stopped. He stood there for a moment, reading it. Then he looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. One nod. The same nod he'd given me when I'd painted Ellen's name on the boat 5 years ago, and it meant the same thing. That what I'd done was right. And that words would only make it smaller. I heard from Vanessa occasionally. A text here and there. She'd moved to Boston. Gotten a job at an accounting firm downtown. She was paying down her debts. Lily visited her 1 weekend a month. Vanessa never asked about the business again. She never asked about the buyout payments, which Ed handled quietly and on schedule. She never came back to Gloucester. I think some places become the shape of the thing you lost in them, and you can't walk through them without walking through the loss. I understood that. I'd felt it every time I walked into the bedroom Ellen and I had shared for 35 years. You don't blame the place. You just can't be in it anymore. Every morning, I went down to the harbor. I stood in front of the boat. Some mornings I talked to Ellen. Some mornings I talked to Marcus. Some mornings I just stood there with my coffee and watched the light come up over the breakwater, that slow gold that Gloucester gets in the early hours, the kind that makes the water look like it's been polished. I thought about the things I'd kept and the things I'd lost and the distance between the two, which was sometimes very large and sometimes so small that I couldn't tell them apart. I thought about Vanessa. Not with anger. Not anymore. I thought about her the way you think about a storm that passed through and did damage, but also cleared the air. She had been grieving and she had been afraid and she had reached for something that wasn't hers. And I had stopped her. And then I had helped her anyway. Because that's what Marcus would have done. That's what Ellen would have done. And I have spent enough of my life not doing what they would have done. I believe God puts people in your life for reasons you don't always understand at the time. I believe He put Tommy in mine 40 years ago so that when the hardest morning of my life came, I wouldn't have to face it alone. I believe He put Lily in this world so that an old man who had lost his wife and his son would have a reason to keep getting up, keep going to the harbor, keep tying knots and telling stories and making sweet tea with too much sugar and not enough lemon. And I believe He put that letter in Marcus's heart before He took Marcus home. Because God knows that sometimes the people we leave behind need to hear our voice one more time, even if it's only on paper, even if it's only to say, the sea doesn't care who's right. It only cares who's ready. Marcus taught me that. Without either of us knowing it at the time, he said it while coiling rope on the back of a fishing boat, and it became the truest sentence I ever carried. I was quiet for weeks, while Vanessa thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I was doing the work that needed doing before the moment arrived. I was reading the water, checking every connection, making sure every knot was tied right before the weight came down. And when the morning came, I was ready. The sweet tea was made. The documents were in order. The people I trusted were in the next room. And the truth was on the table. Lily came on a Saturday in May. The first warm Saturday of the year, the kind where the harbor smells like possibility instead of winter. She ran down the dock the way she always runs, boots untied, jacket half on, yelling Grandpa before she could see me. She got to the boat and stopped. She looked at the stern. She read the letters. She read them again. Her face did something I don't have words for. It was too big for a 6-year-old's face. Too full of understanding for someone who still needed help reaching the top shelf. Grandpa, she said. My name is on the boat. I knelt down beside her. My knees protested. They always do. I looked at her face, Marcus's face, Ellen's eyes, and I said, It's always been your boat, sweetheart. I was just keeping it for you. She hugged me. Small arms around my neck. The smell of her shampoo and the sound of the harbor and the warmth of the morning sun on my back. I held her the way you hold something precious that you almost lost. Not too tight, just enough. The way a bowline holds, firm and steady, designed to keep everything together when the weight pulls. If you've been there, if someone has tried to take apart what your family built while you were still learning how to breathe without the person you lost, if someone used your grief as a door into your life, thinking you were too broken to notice and too old to fight back, I want you to know something. You are allowed to protect what matters. You are allowed to be quiet about it while you get ready. You are allowed to sit at the head of your own table, in your own kitchen, in the house you built with the people you loved, and you are allowed to say, "Now, let's have an honest conversation." You don't have to shout. You don't have to rush. You just have to be ready. And the people who love you, the ones who show up at 7:30 in the morning with a briefcase or a clean flannel shirt or a hand on your shoulder in a dark workshop, they'll be ready with you. The sea doesn't care who's right. It only cares who's ready. Be ready. And if these stories mean something to you, stay with me, because there are more coming. Not all of them end this quietly, but all of them are true. And all of them start the same way, with someone sitting at a table, wondering what to do next, and deciding that the answer is to keep going.